Identity, but not expression memory for unfamiliar faces, is affected by aging. Dargenbow, University of Liège, Belgium, and Linden, University of Geneva, Switzerland. Abstract. We examined age related differences in memory for identity and emotional expression of unfamiliar faces. Younger and older adults were presented with happy and angry faces and were later asked to recognize the same faces displaying a neutral expression. When a face was recognized, they also had to remember what the initial expression of the face had been. In addition, states of awareness associated with both identity and expression memory were assessed with the remember no guess paradigm. Older adults showed less recollective experience than younger adults for identity, but not for emotional expressions of the faces. This evidence indicates that age related differences in memory may depend on the nature of the to be remembered information, with emotional, social information being remembered as well in older as in younger adults. Introduction. There is general agreement in the literature on cognitive aging that episodic memory functioning declines with age. These age related changes vary with the tasks that are used, with losses in performance more pronounced in some tasks than in others. For example, whereas age related declines are slight in many recognition memory tasks, they are substantial in tasks involving free or acute recall. In addition, old people seem to be disproportionately affected in their ability to consciously recollect events and the context in which they occurred. Indeed, there is evidence that age differences in context memory are reliably greater than those in memory for content. Furthermore, it has been found that recognition memory was less often accompanied by a rich recollection of the encoding episode, as assessed by remember responses, in older than in younger adults. Finally, Bartlett and his colleagues repeatedly found that older adults made more false alarms than younger adults during face recognition, and they reported evidence which suggests that this is due to a tendency for older individuals to rely relatively more on perceived familiarity and less on recollection of context in making recognition decisions. Most of these studies used emotionally neutral words or pictures, and it is possible that this bias towards using non emotional stimuli is responsible for the robust age related decline in episodic memory that is typically observed. Indeed, the nature of the stimuli may be particularly important in aging studies because there is evidence that cognitive processing goals shift with age, such that information processing becomes more emotion focused. For instance, it has been found that younger and older adults tend to focus on different dimensions of the same event, with younger adults placing relatively more emphasis on perceptual details than older adults, and older adults focusing more on effective and value based information than younger adults. In addition, other studies suggest that aging is also associated with increased expertise in the social domain. For instance, the ability to discriminate between more or less informative aspects of behaviors in order to make inferences about other people seems to be enhanced in the elderly. An enhanced motivation in older adults to process emotionally slash socially significant information could make the age related decline in episodic memory less pronounced or even eliminated for emotional compared to neutral stimuli. Consistent with this proposition, Carstensen and Turk Charles, 1994, found in a study of prose recall that although older adults remembered less neutral content than young adults, both age groups recalled equivalent amounts of emotional material. More recently, Kensinger, Burley, Medford, Groldon, and Corkin, 2002, also found that young and older adults showed similar memory enhancement effects for emotional words or pictures as compared to neutral items. In addition, Davidson and Glisky, 2002, found that memory for contextual information associated with important emotional news, flashbulb memories, was not affected by aging. Finally, Rahal, May, and Hasher, 2002, reported two studies in which age differences in memory were robust for perceptual source material but were negligible for effective or value based source information. Together, these findings strongly suggest that age related decline in episodic memory may vary according to the emotional salience of the to be remembered information. In the present study, we examine the generalizability of this proposition by assessing memory for two kinds of facial information, which vary according to their social/emotional significance. The human face is a frequent, highly significant social stimulus, which provides various information that can be used to recognize familiar people and also to infer people's age, gender, or emotional state. The perception of invariant aspects of face structure underlies the recognition of individuals, identity recognition, whereas perception of changeable aspects such as eye gaze, expression, and lip movement plays a more central role in social communication. A large body of studies have consistently found that identity recognition of unfamiliar faces is affected by aging. In contrast, memory for emotional expressions has received little interest by researchers, and to the best of our knowledge, no aging studies were specially designed to investigate expression memory. Nevertheless, there are a few studies which are relevant to this issue. In two experiments reported by Bartlett and Leslie in 1986, older and younger participants saw pictures of faces either in a single view condition, in which each face was shown once, or in a multiple view condition, in which each face was shown in four different poses. They were later presented with identical pictures of the faces, pictures of the same faces with a different expression, pictures of the same faces changed in both expression and pose, and pictures of new faces. For each picture, participants were asked to say if the picture was exactly the same, old but different, or new. It was found that in the single views condition, older adults performed worse than younger adults in discriminating identical from changed expression faces, which suggests that their memory for emotion expression was reduced. However, this finding was not replicated in two subsequent experiments in which there were no age related differences in discriminating identical from changed expression items. Finally, in a recent study by Thompson, Aidenehad, and Ponte, 2001, older adults were found to be more prone to reconstruct what people state verbally in a conversation to coincide with the meaning of the facial expressions people displayed during that conversation, which suggests that older adults pay more attention to the facial expression of the speaker than do younger adults. However, expression memory itself was not assessed in this study. It is difficult to draw conclusions about age related differences in facial expression memory from these inconsistent findings. Yet, this is an important issue deserving further investigation because facial expressions are important social cues that enable us to infer intentions and emotions of others and consequently to regulate our behavior adaptively. Furthermore, memory for expressions connoting approval or disapproval probably plays an important role in the retrospective evaluation of social situations, and consequently influences the way one interprets and apprehends current and future interactions. From a methodological point of view, the use of recognition tasks, as was the case in Bartlett and Leslie 1986's and Bartlett's et al. 1989's studies, may not be the best way to assess expression memory. Indeed, in everyday life, we rarely try to remember what the expression of an individual was in a previous situation by seeing the same expression again and choosing it among distractors. Instead, we more probably try to retrieve and reconstruct a visual representation of what that expression was. Accordingly, recall or cued recall tasks might be more appropriate to assess expression memory. The purpose of the present study was to examine age related differences in memory for both identity and emotional expression of unfamiliar faces. Young and older participants were presented with happy and angry faces and were later asked to recognize neutral faces of the same individuals. When a face was recognized, expression memory was assessed by asking participants to decide whether this face had been presented earlier with a happy or an angry expression. In addition, states of awareness associated with both identity and expression memory were assessed with the remember, know, guess procedure. In line with previous findings, we thought that identity memory would be reduced in older adults. Furthermore, if, as it has been argued, this is the consequence of problems with recollection of context, identity recognition should be less often accompanied with remember responses in older than in younger adults. Such an age related decline in recollection has been previously reported for word recognition. But to the best of our knowledge, it has not been examined with face stimuli. In addition, if, as is suggested by several lines of evidence, the processing of emotionally/socially significant information is less affected by aging, we should observe two additional findings. First, there should be an influence of the type of expression displayed by the faces during presentation, happy versus angry, on subsequent identity recognition for both younger and older adults. Indeed, we found in two previous studies with young participants that identity recognition is more often accompanied by remember responses for faces that had been previously seen with a happy expression than for faces previously seen with an angry expression. This effect should also be observed for older adults in the present study. Second, memory for emotional expressions themselves should not differ between young and older participants. Method. Participants. 32 young adults and 32 older adults participated in this study. Both groups consisted of half males and half females. The older adults came from the general community and lived in their own homes. All participants were volunteers and reported themselves to be in good physical and mental health. Years of education were equivalent in the two age groups. Vocabulary performances, as assessed by the Mill Hill, tended to be higher for older than for younger adults, a finding which is frequently reported in aging studies. Scores at the back depression inventory were equivalent in both groups. Materials. Black and white pictures of 24 different faces, 12 males and 12 females, each displaying a neutral, a happy, and an angry expression were used. These pictures were selected from 4 different databases. The stimuli with unusual features, for example, beards or glasses, were not used. All the photos were retouched with Adobe Photoshop software to standardize their frame, size, background color, and, whenever possible, luminosity and contrast. Two sets, A and B, Of 12 faces, 6 males and 6 female were made. Whenever possible, faces in sets A and B were meshed for physical similarities. For example, hair, size, and color, complexion. 6 happy faces, 3 male, 3 female, and 6 angry faces, 3 male and 3 female, were presented during the inspection phase. Ah, the use of sets A and B as studied or non studied items was counterbalanced across participants. Also, within each set, each face was seen with a happy expression by half of the participants and with an angry expression by the other half. This made it possible to look for the effect of face expression on memory unconfounded with differences in the memorability of particular people's faces. Stimuli were placed in a pseudo random but fixed order in such a manner that no more than two faces with the same expression occurred in succession. To counterbalance for order effects, the photos were presented in one order for half the participants and in reverse order for the other half. Two test lists were constructed using the 24 neutral faces. The stimuli were placed in a pseudo random but fixed order so that no more than three old or new faces and no more than two old faces that had the same expression at study should occur in succession. The second list presented the photos in reverse order. Procedure: participants were tested individually. Each face was shown for 5 seconds on a computer screen, approximately 60 centimeters in front of them. They were asked to look carefully at the faces in order to be able to recognize them later. After a 5-minute retention interval, participants were presented with the recognition test. They were told that they would be shown a series of faces, some of which represent the people they had been shown initially, though the expression of the faces had changed. All the faces were neutral. When each item appeared, they had to decide whether they had seen it before. Furthermore, they had to report whether their recognition was of the remember, the know, or the guess variety. The instructions we used to explain the RK and G responses were inspired from those used by Gardner and colleagues. Briefly, participants were told that an R response should be given to any face which, at the time it was recognized, brought back to mind something they had consciously experienced. For example, an association, a thought, a feeling, etc. At the time it was presented. In contrast, they were asked to make a K response if the face felt familiar, but they were unable to recollect details of its prior exposure. Finally, they were asked to make a G response if they were unsure whether or not the face had been presented in the study phase. Participants were also asked to remember the initial expression of the faces they claimed to recognize. They were told that some of the faces they had seen in the study phase had a happy expression and other faces an angry expression. When they classified a face as old, they were asked to decide whether this face had had a happy or angry expression when they first saw it in the study phase. And they also had to classify their responses according to the RK and G paradigm. They were asked to make an R response if they could consciously recall seeing the expression of the face, if they could remember what the expression looked like. They were asked to make a K response if they believed that the face had a particular expression, but they could not consciously recollect what the expression looked like. They were asked to make a G response if they had no idea of the expression and they had guessed. Participants were asked to repeat the instructions concerning the RK and G classification for identity and for emotional expression of the faces, and also to explain the rationale for some of their responses to ensure that they had understood the classification correctly. All the responses were made orally, and each face remained on the screen until participants indicated their responses. Results: identity recognition. Overall identity recognition performances were examined by analyzing total hit scores and false alarms. See Table 1 for mean proportions, as well as discrimination and bias measures derived from signal detection theory. Total hit scores tended to be higher for young, than for older adults, although total hit scores tended to be higher for faces that were previously seen with a happy expression than faces previously seen with an angry expression. This difference failed to reach statistical significance. There was no age by expression type interaction. An analysis of false alarm rates indicated that the elderly made more false alarms than the young. In addition, signal detection analysis revealed that the sensitivity parameter, D line, was higher for young than for older adults, whereas response bias measures, C, was not different between the two groups. We also examined the influence of aging and expression type, happy versus angry, on states of awareness associated with identity recognition by decomposing overall recognition scores into R, K, and G responses. Table 1 shows the mean proportions of R, K, and G responses for identity recognition as a function of age and expression type. Separate 2, age, young versus old versus 2, expression type, happy versus angry, analysis of variance were performed on R, K, and G responses. For R responses, there was a significant main effect of expression type, indicating that recognition of faces that were previously seen with a happy expression was more often associated with a R response than recognition of faces previously seen with an angry expression. Furthermore, younger adults tended to report more R responses than older adults, and there was no age by expression type interaction. The proportion of K responses did not differ between young and older adults, nor between faces that were previously seen with a happy expression and faces previously seen with an angry expression. Furthermore, age did not interact with expression type. Similarly, there were no main effects of age or expression type, nor age by expression type interactions for G responses. Finally, we examine states of awareness associated with false alarms. Table 1 shows the proportions of false alarms associated with RK and G responses for young and older adults. Older adults report more R and K, but not G responses than younger adults. Memory for emotional expressions. Memory for emotional expressions was assessed by determining the probability that a participant's correctly recalled expression conditionalized upon correct identity recognition. For each participant, proportions of correct and incorrect responses for expression memory were calculated separately for each type of expression, happy versus angry. This was made by dividing the number of correct or incorrect R, K, and G responses for each type of expression by the number of correct identity recognitions for that type of expression. Data from one older adult were dropped because he did not recognize any faces previously presented with a happy expression. Table 2 shows mean proportions of RK and G responses for expression memory as a function of age and expression type. Separate 2, age, young versus old, and versus 2, expression type, happy versus angry. ANOVAs were performed on total correct responses and on correct RK and G responses. For total correct responses, there was no significant effect of age, nor of expression type, and the age by expression type interaction was also not significant. Although the proportion of total correct responses of young and older adults was somewhat low, it was significantly higher than chance for both groups. When considering qualitative aspects of expression memory, the proportions of our responses were equivalent in young and older adults. Similarly, there were no significant effects of age on K and G responses. Furthermore, the proportion of R, K, and G responses were not different for happy and angry expressions. Finally, there was no age by expression type interaction on either R, K, or G responses. Discussion. We investigated the influence of aging on both identity recognition and memory for emotional expression of unfamiliar faces. We found that identity recognition, as indexed by D Line, was better for young than older adults. Total hit scores tended to be higher for young than older adults made more false alarms than younger adults. A finding that is consistent with previous studies which examined the influence of aging on face recognition. Identity recognition was also less often associated with an R response in older than in younger adults. This finding extends previous studies that found a decrease in R responses associated with word recognition in the elderly by showing that such an age related decline in recollection is not restricted to verbal material. We also found that young and older adults did not differ in regard to K and G responses. Finally, false alarms were more often associated with R and K but not G responses for older than for younger adults. Overall, these findings indicate that identity of unfamiliar faces is less richly recollected in older than in younger adults. Although identity recognition was affected by aging, the influence of happy and angry expressions on identity recognition was the same in both young and older adults, with faces that were previously seen with a happy expression receiving more R responses than faces previously seen with an angry expression. Such an influence of expression type on identity memory was also found in two previous studies with young adults, and we argued that it can be explained by the social meaning of emotional expressions for the self. Indeed, it has been found that the degree of elaboration and attention during encoding affected the proportion of our responses. For instance, when attentional resources are engaged in a concurrent task during face encoding, the R component of recognition memory tends to be reduced while the proportion of K responses remains unaffected. In addition, there is evidence that most people tend to process preferentially positive rather than negative social information that is self relevant, such as feedback provided by other people. Facial expressions of emotions are highly significant social stimuli that play an important role in the regulation of social interactions by providing feedback about attitudes, intentions, and emotional states. A happy expression denotes approval and satisfaction with our current behavior or attitude, whereas a, an angry expression denotes disapproval, a greater motivation to process positive rather than negative face stimuli should therefore make a positive face to be more richly recollected in memory, which is consistent with our previous findings with young adults. The present study extends these findings by showing that, although identity memory is affected by aging, the memory bias for faces with positive expressions is similar in young and older adults. Therefore, it seems that the modulation of memory performances by motivational factors, such as the relevance of information to processing goals of the self, is not affected by aging. Another important finding of the present study is that older adults were not impaired in memory for emotional expressions of the faces. Most interesting was the finding that, contrary to identity memory, the proportion of all responses associated with expression memory was not different between younger and older adults. Therefore, there was no age related reduction in the recollective experience for information with important emotional/social value. This finding is consistent with others showing that the typical age related decline in episodic memory is, at least in part, dependent on the stimuli that are used. With age, information processing goals shift, leading older adults to be more motivated to process emotionally significant information. This differential importance of emotional/social stimuli could make older people devote preferentially their limited information processing resources to this kind of information, thus limiting their memory difficulties for emotional relative to neutral stimuli. Such a focus on emotional stimuli would be adaptive because emotion often signals that an event has important implications for the goals of an individual, and consequently, memory for this information is important in making decisions and in regulating present and future behaviors. Finally, one could speculate about the reasons why older adults sometimes show reduced recollective experience and sometimes do not. Previous studies suggest that the often reported age related decline in recollective experience is the consequence of a reduced ability for older people to spontaneously initiate adequate, elaborative encoding strategies. Indeed, Perfect and Dasgupta, 1994, asked older and younger participants to say everything they were thinking about when encoding words and non words. They found that older adults use encoding strategies less often than younger adults. However, once these encoding differences had been taken into account by focusing exclusively on those items that received elaborative encoding, there were no age effects on reported recollective experience. Furthermore, Perfect et al. 1995 experiment 2 found that after depth of processing instructions were given to constraints the nature of encoding, the age difference in recollective experience was reduced. From these findings, Perfect and Dasgupta 1997 concluded that older adults show reduced recollective experience because of poorer encoding rather than because of a failure to reintegrate item and context at retrieval. The present finding further suggests that not all information is poorly encoded by older adults. Information that is highly relevant to their processing goals may trigger elaborate encoding strategies in older people, thereby ensuring that this important information can be richly recollected subsequently. In summary, we sought to investigate age related differences in memory for two kinds of facial information that vary according to their emotional/slash social value. We found that aging was associated with a decline in memory for identity, but not for emotional expression of unfamiliar faces. This evidence indicates that age related differences in memory may depend on the nature of the to be remembered information, with emotional/slash social information being remembered just as well by older as by younger adults.